I don't know of anybody who combines the range of subjects on which he knows a hell of a lot with the depth and detail with which he seems to know about all of them. When you have a subject like dimensions of interaction between rural and urban India, you can go again across a wide canvas, and I wait, like all of us, to see how he develops the themes in that broad framework. So, Dr. Sen, over to you.
What actually drew my attention to the issue of urbanization, and which in a sense will form the bedrock of this particular lecture, is that over the 20-odd years that I've been at the policymaking level in government, almost every government scheme which was aimed towards improving the living standards of rural India were justified not on the basis of the human development impact of these schemes. They were always couched in one specific phrase, which was reduce migration. I mean, this has been an obsession in government in India. And it's an obsession which I was a little puzzled about, and so being curious, I started to look around and see what was the global experience, what was the attitude towards urbanization around the world. And the results were actually quite remarkable, which is that by and large, for most countries, except a few countries in Africa, most countries looked on urbanization as a good thing. Whereas we looked on urbanization as something that was to be avoided, if at all possible, by the government. Which raises the question, why? Why is this? And why is this attitude so all-pervasive? It's not just within the government. I suspect a lot of you also probably think the same way. One possible answer is what Mahatma Gandhi said: the soul of India lives in her villages, and we want to preserve that soul. But all of us, I think, are literate enough to know what the global experience with urbanization is. And the global experience with urbanization is that growth and productivity are very closely and very strongly linked to the process of urbanization. Societies which tend to stay rural also tend to be not very fast growing. We tend to think of migration as people leaving their home villages and coming to the cities for a better life, right? Surprise. The bulk of migration in India is rural to rural. It is not rural to urban. People in rural India are moving within rural India. Why they do it, how they do it, that's something which has actually not been studied. It's gone completely under the radar screen of all policymakers at all points in time in this country. But rural to rural migration is about 3 times larger than rural to urban migration. Let me just take you through the way economists have thought about the processes. And much of this discussion dates back to 1954, the classic paper by Sir Arthur Lewis, where he posited the existence of a dynamic, high productivity industrial sector, which is urban in character, and a relatively low productivity, low accumulation sector, which is the agricultural sector in the rural areas. And naturally, because of high productivity in industry, it attracts people from the rural areas, which feeds the need for the industry that the industry has for workers. And this is the process that drives urbanization and growth. The Lewis model actually fits remarkably well to the experiences of most of the developed countries around the world. But in most of the developing countries, or at least a very large portion of it, it doesn't work quite as well. The reason for that, I think, was expounded many years after Sir Arthur Lewis, which was, I think, in the late 60s, or maybe I think 68 or 69. There's this paper by Harris and Todaro, which says that there's actually an intermediary step. That is, a person who leaves the rural area and comes to the urban area doesn't automatically get absorbed in the industrial sector, and usually ekes out a subsistence in the informal urban economy. And that's the via media through which the transfer takes place. There's been a fair amount of work on the nature of this informal urban economy. And what it suggests is that the informal economy is where the rural worker who has migrated really does the learning which is necessary for him to be able to plug into the industrial system. And the informal sector provides him with the earnings that he will need to be able to support himself through the learning process. So the informal sector is very important. I'm not going to the whole Harris-Todaro bit, and there are probabilities involved. None of that is important. What is important is to recognize the importance of the existence of this informal urban sector. Right? So think of the Indian economy then as essentially comprising of three sectors: the rural sector at large, the urban informal economy, and the urban formal economy. By and large, as I think most of us know, the rural economy by itself, that is, if I take out the so-called census towns, which are in no sense industrial, what it will come to is roughly about 62% of India is rural. Then you would have a chunk which would be the urban informal, which would be about a little over 20%, and the rest is the more formal urban, which is what everybody is aspiring to. That's roughly how it breaks down. So the process that Harris-Todaro talks about, and the process that we are seeing out here, is the process by which somebody in the rural area, when he looks at the option of moving to urban areas, of migrating, he doesn't really look at what the guy is earning in the Maruti factory. What he looks at is what are his brethren who are in the urban informal sector, what is it that they are earning, and whether it makes sense for him to take that plunge. So it matters a great deal as to what are the standards of living, not so much in urban area on average, but the informal component of the urban areas vis-a-vis the rural areas. If you think of it this way, and instead of comparing the urban areas on average, which have relatively low proportion of the formal, but with very, very high numbers in terms of lifestyle, productivity, whatever you have. Look at what is happening in the informal sectors in India, and then ask the question, is the average Indian better off staying in the village or moving? And the answer, surprisingly, is that the rural Indian is a perfectly rational human being. He'd be a complete idiot to move to the cities. In parameter, across parameter, including economic parameters, that is, if you make appropriate adjustments for cost of living, you are better off being poor in rural India than being poor in urban India. This is true of economics, it's true of health, it's now getting true of education, although that didn't used to be the case. It's certainly true as far as crime is concerned. that is sense of security that you have. And so we have gotten into an equilibrium where, because of the non-dynamism, as it were, of informal urban India, we as a country are not following the processes that led to development and growth in large parts of the world. We've come to some kind of, perhaps a very undesirable kind of equilibrium, where no matter how bad things are in rural India, they get worse if you move. Now, in this context, at the heart of this whole understanding of informality is really the issue of slums. Slums. Again, if one looks at the public discourse on slums, we are terribly ashamed of them. We think they're terrible things. We think they should not exist. We do our utmost to prevent slums from happening. The fact is, again, globally and over time, in every country, slums have been a natural corollary to the process of urbanization. Not only can you not do without slums, you should not do without slums. Because when a person is moving from a rural area to an urban area, then almost by definition, he or she shall not have the economic wherewithal to be able to afford to live in anything other than a slum. Slums start vanishing when the balance between the rural and the urban happens. Usually, depending upon which country you're dealing with, this happens when the urban population exceeds 80% of the total country's population. Usually, maybe even lower than that. Until then, slums will exist and will continue to exist. For a country where we are looking at 600, 800 cities, forget about towns. Those are the kind of numbers we are looking at. We simply do not have the capacity to plan it. And we haven't even begun the process. Not only have we not begun the process, the point is, if you think of the people who man our so-called urban planning departments in the government, most of them are essentially civil engineers with very little idea as to what planning is all about. They know construction. They know how things should be built. They don't know why should they be distributed in a particular way. This is a recognition which, oddly enough, doesn't seem to have sunk into us at all. And we've been at this game now for 60 years. We plan all manner of things. What we cannot and do not and will not be able to do, at least in the near future, is do any kind of meaningful urban planning. And by urban planning, I don't mean planning for the metros. That's a problem enough. I mean urban planning from the day a particular location, a particular village, starts acquiring the characteristics of an urban area. That's the level at which you have to start planning from. Ever since Mr. Modi announced smart cities, I am told that the large consulting companies have been scouting the world around to find people who can come in and help us in designing smart cities, because there is no local talent available. That is where we are at. At the heart of all of this is again what I started out with, which is a mindset which says people are better off in villages. may be true. There are, I think, game-changing influences that are happening because of technology. The mobile revolution has made a very large chunk of the benefits of urbanization already significantly weaker. But it certainly cannot and will not ever be able to take care of the other dimensions of urbanization which lead to high productivity and growth. And what are these dimensions are fairly obvious. It is that when you have people together, you have deep markets for labor and for products. What you also have is the ability of companies to go in for tight specialization, for a much higher degree of division of labor, all of which are essential attributes to increasing productivity. These will not happen just because of the communication revolution. You still need the propinquity that comes with an urban area. And you need to be able to make it work. So in terms of how we think about it, what I would suggest very strongly is focus on the intermediate point, and that intermediate point is the informal urban economy. Look at our plans. Look at any of our plans. You will find there's a lot that goes into the formal sector. In fact, most of our policies are aimed at the formal sector. There's an even larger amount which is aimed at the rural economy, but the urban informal economy is just mentioned in passing. We have no excuse me. We have no attitude towards it in an important sense. We don't know what to do with it. And I think we'd better start the process where we situate the urban informal economy exactly where it deserves to be, which is at the center stage of our development strategy. Sure, we must develop rural India. But if we are to get the kind of growth that we need and we deserve, then we must make sure that we do not get into a situation where the urban informal sector becomes so unattractive that the benefits of urbanization completely bypass this country.